Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Sadia Qureshi, where we're talking about human spectacles. So we'll be thinking about anthropology and the politics of display. So as we'll get into this, we'll see some connections with the forms of entertainment that we looked at last week, but first I wanted to give some background on anthropology and the social sciences, specifically how the social sciences impact legal status, and then talk about the intersection of science, entertainment, and display. And I'll leave you with a few questions to keep in mind as you read Sadia Qureshi's article. Okay, so what is anthropology? We may have some anthropologists in the house. So overall, anthropology is a discipline that studies difference. It studies races, cultures, and the evolution of the human species more broadly. And anthropology has its roots in the Enlightenment, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. So what we want to keep in mind is that anthropology comes out of this process of colonization and colonialism, which we talked about as well. So anthropology responds to this experience of human diversity and human difference that happens inside of the colonial context. And so who are the anthropologists? They are members of the colonizing culture. So anthropology possesses this imperfect power balance, right? This power imbalance between the view of the colonizer / anthropologist viewing the colonized people, right? So we want to keep in mind what we talked about some weeks ago in terms of the colonial mindset that very much applies to the way that 19th century anthropology conducted its work. So there's two branches of anthropology that come up in our article that I wanted to mention briefly. One is ethnology and the other is physiognomy. So ethnology is a branch of anthropology that uses a comparative approach to talk about human difference. And so in that way, one is using their own home culture as a basis for comparison. And so that should remind us back to that power imbalance that is the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. If you're consistently using your home culture as the superior culture, you are consistently going to come up with a conclusion about the supposed inferiority of those that you are colonizing. Physiognomy, on the other hand, is this desire to link physical characteristics to something about a person's interior life, their character. So a physiognomist might look at my face and say, she's got the brow of a criminal and the nose of an imbecile, or something like that, right? So it's this idea that our outward appearance, our physique, the structure of our face is telling us something about the kind of people we are. So physiognomy was really popular, and this is a documentation of all the noses of England, as if you could learn something by documenting every single type of nose that there was in England. So yeah, physiognomy, very strange. Okay. So, as we mentioned, anthropology comes out of this era of enlightenment, and as we discussed during week 2, these ideas of citizenship, equality, and natural rights were taking hold as very popular political and philosophical beliefs in this era of enlightenment. There was this kind of desire to solve this contradiction between this idea that humans are born free with these sets of rights and this desire to maintain racial inequality that a white power structure benefited from. So what we're kind of seeing here is that in the same way that Jefferson wanted to kind of phone a friend and get, science or proof or whatever to help him out to excuse the maintenance of racial inequality, we see thinkers and lawmakers turning to this more codified and more official form of scholarly practice, the science of ethnology, to affirm the continued exclusion of non-white individuals from this new category of equality. So these scientific categories of race that develop in the 19th century give a bunch of authority to the kind of practices of exclusion and inequality that are part of state building, either in slave-based United States or in the colonial context. Okay, so just an example of how ethnology works in action. So in the case of Dred Scott, which we may be familiar with, Dred Scott is an individual who was suing for his family's freedom. So the person who enslaved him passed away, and when he passed away, Scott and his family were in a free state. And so there was a doctrine on the books that said once free, always free, so that would have freed Scott and his family from being enslaved. So the St. Louis court that they brought their case in front of found in favor of the Scotts. So the family of the enslaver appealed this decision, and it sent the case to the Missouri Supreme Court. And the Missouri Supreme Court decided in favor of the enslaver's family. Series of appeals leads the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so when it arrives at the Supreme Court, there's a really dramatic decision being come to that is very broad in its impact and changed not only Scott's future, but the future of all African American individuals in the United States. So in 1857, the court came to a decision, 7-2, 7 justices deciding in the majority that because Scott was an African American, he was not a citizen, and therefore he couldn't even use the court in any fashion whatsoever. So that's pretty dramatic, right? This is extending beyond his desire to claim his own freedom, but essentially he is being told, and he and every other African American person in the United States is being told that they can't use the courts in any way at all. So this essentially denied citizenship for all African American individuals, free or enslaved. And so what we're seeing here is that this court decision essentially formalizes or puts down in writing that contradiction that we talked about a couple weeks ago, which makes clear to whom the rights and privileges of equality, freedom, and citizenship are available, right? So those contradictions we talked about in our discussions about the White House are becoming codified officially in the 19th century. So what we see happening in the decision that the Supreme Court comes to, they have to write up an extensive document that explains why they decided what they came to. And so the court cites all of this ethnological research, right, quote unquote research, that supports this decision on the grounds of, right, the supposed inferiority of African American individuals as a justification for denying them any rights. So this is essentially the way that the social sciences play into the development of this codification of the officially kind of making clear the contradiction in the Enlightenment category of equality, that equality only works when everybody is the same, and as soon as everybody's not the same, then sorry, we're going to use kind of pseudoscientific research to deny rights. Okay, so this really broad-reaching decision contributes to the outbreak of the Civil War, and likewise, as anyone familiar with the U.S. justice system, we know that it has a long way to go before it can be said that it treats everyone equally regardless of their racial identity. Okay, so as we're sort of discussing this concept of race, right, anthropology and ethnology become instrumental in constructing this modern conception of race. But what's really important for us to conceive of is that race is a social construct. It's not anything biological. It's not fixed. It's not coherent. It changes depending on the social, cultural, political, and economic context in which it's used, right? So it's an idea, it's not fact. That's what historian Painter suggests here. So what this means is, like, while we might not believe that race is something that is biological in its nature, it doesn't need science to operate as a kind of powerful force in society. These historical associations with biological research or ethnological research give the construct of race a lot of power. And as we noted a moment ago, the way that its association with scientific research contributed to its use in legal context, right, continues to kind of build this construct into something that is not scientifically viable, but has very real legal and social repercussions for individuals living in a system in which the category of race is allowed to function. Okay, so Turning to our discussion of display, which we've been talking about in terms of our discussion of entertainment last week. So anthropology and ethnology are all about displaying their research in collections that the public encounters. And so when we're thinking about the power of collections, essentially what the collection is supposed to do is to represent the entirety of the culture from which it's derived, right? That the collection is this stand-in, this intermediary between the viewer and the culture that is being represented. So when we're thinking about where these collections are being displayed, anthropology and ethnology have a lot of public-facing manifestations in the context of museums and World's Fairs, which we'll talk about in a moment. So these new places in which anthropological research is being displayed often reflect the colonial power dynamics that shaped the moment at which the objects, or as we'll talk about later, persons were collected or abducted. Okay. So what's interesting for us to keep in mind in light of our conversation last week is that anthropology and ethnology and other social sciences are sort of playing in the same fields as mass entertainment. They're very linked. So the kind of ideas of strict disciplines between the sciences, social sciences, and entertainment weren't really functioning in the same way in the 19th century. So all of these things are sort of occupying the same space and are interested in reaching the public. And so anthropology reaches the public through natural history museums. The LA has one that we may be familiar with, and then these World's Fairs that are taking place in the major cities throughout the United States and Europe. So these spaces, like the World's Fairs, are really interesting, especially in connection to the panorama that we talked about last week, because the fairs also offered this opportunity to travel without having to go anywhere. But in addition to offering that, what we see the purpose of the fair being is to kind of brag about the host country, whether it's the United States, whether it's England or France, to brag about industrial achievement, how amazing the future of these countries are going to be. In the case of London and Paris, to brag about the colonial holdings of their respective nations, and then to kind of demonstrate through display the dominance of these colonial powers over the folks that they're colonizing. So the purpose of these displays are not only to brag about how great the host country is, but also to make clear that these colonial projects are the product of good kind of research about the supposed inferiority of the folks being colonized. And as we'll read about in our article, outside of the context of the World's Fairs, displays of individuals from colonial holdings become super popular as mass entertainment sort of on the street corner. And so we'll read about how that works in London, and specifically when we get into our article by Sadia Qureshi. Okay, so these are just a few questions I'd like you all to keep in mind. We'll talk more about the World's Fairs and look at some images from them when we get together for our Zoom class on Wednesday. Sorry, couldn't remember from what. So take a look at these questions and keep these in mind as you're getting into Sadia Qureshi's article. It's a tough one. Just as a warning, some of the information that comes up in the article is pretty disturbing, so just as a warning before you get into it. But it is a really fascinating and a really valuable read, and I look forward to talking about it with all of you during our Zoom meeting. Okay, take care.